Welcome back to the channel. My name is Chris Morris, and in this video, I'm going to try to give you 10 reasons why you might be wrong about the 10 Commandments. Now, everybody knows what the 10 Commandments are. They need little introduction, so I'm not going to try to give them an introduction. I just want to start jumping right into the first reason that I think you might actually have misunderstood them, and I'm going to go commandment by commandment and deal with what is probably a very widely held misunderstanding. And the very first one, thou shalt have no other gods before me, you have probably been told this means something like that God really has to be your greatest priority. But that's not what the commandment actually means. The word here is very literal. Have nothing before me, have nothing in my presence. When God looks out over the nation of Israel and the whole world, he doesn't want to see any idols whatsoever, no gods among his people. He should have no gods in his presence, none before him. This is actually speaks then of the purity of worship and the purity of devotion that God expects of his children. Number two, we are not to have any graven images, and very often we're thought this is very straightforward. This just means don't make an idol because God doesn't like idol worship. That's as true as far as it goes, but if you stop there, that's a misunderstanding. What the passage is actually concerned about was that if the Israelites were to make an idol, they would be misrepresenting God because God is greater and bigger and more powerful than any of that. And in fact, going further, God has already given us the physical image to represent him, and that image he has given us is humanity. We are made in his image, which literally has the idea that an image is a visible representation of that which is invisible. And therefore, the idea is when you look at humans, you're supposed to see something like what God is. As God rules over the entire world, this is why Genesis 1:26 through 28 says that humans are supposed to rule over the world. This is why Jesus Christ is such a phenomenal fulfillment, because he is the image of the invisible God, being that he is the one who is the greatest and most perfect human and actually ultimately will rule everything. Number three, don't take the Lord's name in vain. And you probably have been told since you were a child, this means don't swear, don't curse, don't cry out God's name when you strike your thumb with a hammer. But in fact, this has a much more significant meaning. The word take there refers to the same idea as when a woman takes her husband's name in marriage. And this word can be properly translated receive. Do not receive the Lord's name in vain. This passage is actually speaking to our covenant faithfulness we are to have with God. In other words, don't call yourself a follower of Yahweh, or we might say a follower of Christ, a Christian, and then not live like it. Number four, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Once again, you have probably been taught that this means something like take a day of rest. But in fact, this passage is saying so much more. The command is particularly concerned with keeping God at the center of all things. This is especially true when you don't have Publix or grocery stores on the weekend. And if you take a day off work, who's going to milk the cows? Who's going to make sure that the grains get picked and things like that? What God is actually saying is, take a day off, not simply because you're tired, but because even though you're not working, trust me to take care of your needs. That's why for another video, the whole purpose of tithing was to give the first of your fruits, because to recognize that God is the source of all blessing. It's the same idea in the call to the Sabbath. The fifth commandment is to honor your parents. And this seems very straightforward. How can we misunderstand this? It's just about honoring your parents, right? Actually, this passage is much deeper. It's much more concerned with honoring authority more generally, ultimately honoring God. The idea here is that in disrespecting your parents, you're disrespecting authority figures. And what this does is causes a society to collapse. Any society in which people cannot respect authority is one that's not going to last long. Now, this does not necessarily imply that we should be totalitarians and we should bow down to our rulers as if they are living gods. Once again, this is the idea of your parents. Your parents are supposed to love you. And so there are some limitations intrinsic in the whole idea of authority. But still, the idea remains that God is deeply concerned with this passage in the social structure. It's also worth noting that this particular commandment stands at the bridge, if you will, between the first set of commandments that deal with our relationship with God and the second set of commandments that deal with our relationship with each other. Once again, this commandment is emphasizing that God is deeply interested in maintaining the social order, the social structure, because as important as my relationship is with God, my relationship with my fellow human beings and the health of the community in which I live is just as important to him. Commandment number 6, don't kill. Now, you already know, I'm sure, that don't kill is actually more probably better translated as don't murder. And as far as that goes, that is true. But where you need to take this further is that when you lash out and strike out at murder, remember that man is made in the image of God. What you're actually doing is striking at the very image of God himself. This is doubly important considering that we just had a command regarding authority. When we take this authority into our own hands to strike out and kill another person, we have usurped the authority of those who properly are over us. So murder, as terrible and heinous a sin as it is much more serious because of the communal implications of what it does to society and the claim that you are now attacking God himself. Moving on to the seventh commandment, don't commit adultery. This is typically misunderstood to simply mean emphatically not to cheat on your spouse. Now, let me be clear. This certainly does include don't cheat on your spouse. That's certainly well within the range of the meaning of this text. In fact, the Old and the New Testaments will use this passage to talk about the importance of fidelity to our spouse precisely because it is our marriage to our spouse that so beautifully illustrates the relationship we should have with God or with Christ. But again, this law is saying more. Keep in mind the social context in which this passage, this command was written. You didn't have, for example, some of the capacities that we have now to prevent, say, the conceiving of children if a person were to step outside of their marriage. And imagine the kind of havoc that would create once again on the social structure. You didn't have DNA tests, and so you wouldn't know which children belong to who and which inheritance belonged to who. And so this is a very important idea of preserving livelihoods, preserving inheritances, things like that. The idea here is very, very much is God's promise to give Israel an inheritance. And so there's a real spiritual sense here, including not only spiritual, but ultimately a physical sense here, in which to be faithful to God is to receive what was promised you, what is due you, what you are to inherit by God's promise. And in a similar way, to be faithful to your spouse, to produce that family, to raise those particular children, is to give them the inheritance that is due theirs in virtue of being your children, your family. So this law, I would suggest, has much more to do with preserving the family unit and holding that as the foundation of society, as the means by which inheritances are passed on. The Eighth Commandment is not to steal. And here the standard misinterpretation is, once again, to simply take it to mean that we're just not to steal, as if not stealing is to understand the commandment. In fact, this passage is about much more. This is, again, perhaps difficult for us in modern Western culture to understand when we can watch YouTube videos and we live in a world of abundance. If someone steals from me, I am being robbed of an inconvenience. And that is terribly unfortunate, and it's not fun, and it really is wrong on a lot of levels. But in the society in which we're talking about, this is a society of scarcity. And so when you steal from someone, you are probably very literally stealing the only food they had to eat that day or their livelihood. This could have drastic impacts, not only on their lives, but again, on the community as a whole, as opposed to stealing, because once again, the concern is a society of scarcity. Chances are that people were stealing precisely because they had little to nothing themselves. And so the idea here is, rather than steal from another when they have very little, you should trust God instead to provide you your needs, or go through those means that he has provided to help you meet those needs when you have them. The Ninth Commandment is not to bear false witness. And the misunderstanding here is that this typically gets reduced to don't lie, or positively always tell the truth. Now, as far as that goes, that's true, and that would fall under this command. But bearing false witness actually has the connotation, it's a legal connotation of going to court and witnessing against someone and telling a falsehood, or lying, if you will, about what they did or did not do in a criminal setting. In other words, what this commandment is actually about is about preserving justice. Now, justice is very important to God, because without justice, you cannot have a functioning society. God is deeply concerned not only about his relationship with us being just, but about our relationship with one another being just as well. And so if you're at all concerned about justice, the command not to bear false witness really is the one you should be considering very deeply in your meditations. And finally, the 10th commandment is not to covet. And once again, this might seem very straightforward and very simple. I mean, how much simpler could it be? Don't want stuff that's not yours. But as you might expect, If you leave it there, you've misunderstood, because it actually goes much deeper. This commandment is actually about being content with what you have. And what this commandment does is guard us against a sense of victimhood, in the sense of, I have been robbed by someone else. What they have, I ought to have. It ought to be mine. That person, that thing, that house, they have some sense robbed that of me, and therefore it ought to be mine. This passage serves as an important balance against the Ninth Commandment, not to bear false witness, but it equally calls us to trust in God that He will vindicate us and to meet our needs as they come up. So perhaps you can see a theme that is developing, starting with not murdering, to not committing adultery, to not stealing, to not bearing false witness, here finally to not coveting. This is this important idea that once again we started in the Fifth Commandment, which is God is deeply concerned with, first of all, the social order, and second of all, trusting Him. And notice we have this thing that preachers have often pointed out: if my relationship with God is good, if I have trusted Him to provide in all things, then my relationship with others can be good as well. As long as I am just with God and I trust Him to take care of my needs, then I can be just with others, not steal from them what is not mine, and not expect them to provide for mine what is not due to me. So there you have it, 10 ways that you might have misunderstood the 10 commandments. But before we go, let me give you one quick bonus way that I think is really important for your understanding of all these previous 10 that we have just laid out. And it is this: many preachers and theologians will tell you that the Old Testament law is divided into three parts: the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the civil law. And then they want to go on to argue that Jesus, in His death, burial, and resurrection, has fulfilled and done away with the ceremonial law and the civil law, leaving the moral law, i.e. the 10 commandments, for Christians to live under as a moral guide. This is not true. When Jesus has fulfilled and done away with the law, He has fulfilled and done away with all the law, including the 10 commandments. That's right. You are not under the 10 commandments as a law. Don't let that shock you. Remember, the 10 commandments are not fundamentally moral laws, not even the commandment not to murder or commit adultery. These are not moral laws. They are, in a word, kingdom laws or spiritual laws, or they are laws dealing with righteousness. And righteousness and morality are not the same thing. Righteousness may certainly say something about morality, but you can be moral and not righteous. And again, this does not mean because we're not under the 10 commandments as laws, therefore we are free from morality. Gentiles who were never under the law were never free to murder as they saw fit. The moral law is the moral law, and the 10 commandments are not merely moral laws. Ultimately, fulfilled in Christ, they are about our relationship with God and with His people. This then certainly does not mean that they're no longer applicable. Perhaps you've seen the last few minutes as we studied through them. They're incredibly applicable. They tell us something about what God expects from His children and what God expects a relationship with His children to look like among themselves. But it doesn't mean once again we're under them as law. They are deeply applicable, and they speak to God's children because they give us ideas of what truly righteous relationships look like. So with that said, I hope you have found this interesting. I hope you have found it helpful. If so, leave some comments below what you liked, what you didn't like. If there was something you disagree with, by all means, let me know down in the comments below, and we will continue the conversation there. Until next time, may God richly bless you.